Let me tell you about four people. Robert is 68, Karen is 52, Marcus is 38, Zoe is 24. Four different lives, four different decades, four different economic realities. And yet, when I look at them carefully, I do not see four separate financial stories. I see one mistake wearing four different outfits. That is what makes this so dangerous. If the mistake were dramatic, if it looked like a scandal or a breakdown or a casino binge, people would notice it more easily. They would point at it and say, there it is. That is what ruins people. But this mistake is quieter than that. It does not look reckless from the inside. It looks normal. It looks responsible, looks like progress, it looks like doing well. That is why almost every generation repeats it. It arrives through the culture, through the people around you, through what gets admired, through what gets photographed, through what gets praised, and through what quietly becomes the shared definition of a life that appears successful. Then one day you realize you have spent years, sometimes decades, building the appearance of arrival while underfunding the thing that would have made arrival real. That is the trap. And once you see it clearly, you start noticing it everywhere. I have spent my whole life around money, around markets, around ambition, around people trying to get somewhere. And I can tell you that most financial failure is not the result of one grand act of stupidity. It is usually the result of a socially approved sequence, a set of steps that almost everyone around you also took, a pattern so familiar that no one thinks to question it while it is happening. That is what makes it powerful. The world does not usually ruin people by persuading them to do obviously foolish things. It ruins them more elegantly than that. It gives them a version of success they can afford to imitate before they can afford to sustain. That is the real problem. So let us begin there. Not with budgets, not with investing, not with some generic lecture about discipline. Let us begin with the most important question in the whole conversation. What did your generation teach you that doing well was supposed to look like? Because that answer may explain more about your current financial life than any spreadsheet ever will. Robert grew up in an America where owning a house meant something large, not psychologically large, civilizationally large. His parents rented their whole lives to them. Ownership was not just a financial milestone. It was dignity. It was proof that you had stepped into a different class of stability. A home was not only shelter, it was status, it was adulthood made visible, a lawn, a driveway, a kitchen you could improve because it was yours, a neighborhood you belonged to. The American dream was not abstract in Robert S. world. It had a mortgage attached to it. So when Robert got his first decent job and the bank approved him for the biggest loan he could qualify for, of course he took it. Why wouldn't he? That was the move. That was what a serious man did. And here is the important part. At the time, it made sense. That is why these traps are so difficult to see. They are not always irrational at the beginning. In Robert S. era, property did appreciate. Inflation was high, yes, but the house gained value, the neighborhood improved, the asset multiplied on paper. Robert was not insane. He was following a map that had worked for many people before him. That is what makes his story so revealing, because the trap is almost never that the first decision was obviously wrong. The trap is believing that one good asset is the whole plan. Robert's house is worth several times what he paid for it. If you look at his balance sheet quickly, he appears wealthy. And in one sense, he is. But wealth that cannot easily support the life you need is a different thing from wealth you can actually live on. That is the part people learn too late. Robert does not have the pension he thought he would have. His company changed, the world changed. The old guarantees dissolved. He has savings, yes, but not enough to make the next 25 years feel easy. Most of his net worth lives in the walls around him. Selling the house would mean leaving the place where he raised his family, the street he knows, the life he recognizes. That is no small thing. The home was not the mistake. The belief that the home was enough, that was the mistake. That is what I want you to notice. The signal of wealth became a substitute for the full structure of wealth. Robert spent decades maintaining the symbol. Extensions, repairs, garden, upgrades, care, all sensible, all understandable. And while he was doing that, other parts of the structure remained weaker than they should have been. The arrival looked real from the street. The resilience underneath it was thinner than anyone wanted to admit. That is one version of the trap. Now Karen's generation was taught a slightly different story. Not just own the house, live the upgraded life. Gen X came of age watching their parents work hard through old structures and wanted something cleaner, bigger, more modern, more visibly comfortable. They believed, with reason, that they would earn more, and many of them did. That is one reason Karen's story is so instructive. It is not a story of failure through lack of income. It is a story of income that kept arriving and somehow never turned into the feeling of real margin. Karen got promotions. Karen's household income rose. Karen hit numbers her parents never saw. And every time that happened, life expanded to greet the new money, a better car, a larger house, a holiday further away, better schools, better furniture, a nicer version of normal every time. None of these choices looked ridiculous. That is exactly why they accumulated so quietly. The problem was not that Karen spent. The problem was that each raise produced not a larger financial gap but a larger lifestyle. If her income rose by 20%, her obligations rose almost in rhythm with it. The life looked better, the structure stayed strangely tight. That is what lifestyle creep really is, not extravagance. Not some silly weakness of character. It is the habit of converting income growth into visible consumption before converting it into invisible strength. That is one of the great financial diseases of middle age because it wears the face of success. People admire it, they call it having done well. And if your whole peer group is doing it too, then nobody around you is likely to say the uncomfortable thing, which is that you may be delivering the signal of prosperity every month on direct debit while barely widening the underlying gap between what comes in and what goes out. Karen's trap was not the big one, time purchase. It was the 100 small, of course, decisions. Of course we can upgrade now. Of course we deserve this. Of course the children should have this. Of course the holiday should be a little better. Of course the kitchen should reflect the income. Of course this is what doing well looks like. And when a whole generation normalizes that pattern, the trap becomes nearly invisible. A person can arrive at 52 looking prosperous, with a decent salary, equity, possessions, and still feel an uncomfortable tightness when she runs the retirement math honestly. That is the lesson. Income by itself does not create wealth. The savings gap does. The asset base does. The things that are not visible in the holiday photo do. That is Karen S. version of the same mistake. Now Marcus, and this is where many people become defensive because the millennial story includes genuine structural betrayal. I do not dismiss that. The 2008 crisis was not some minor inconvenience. It broke the early financial adulthood of an entire cohort. Jobs vanished, career tracks stalled, housing affordability moved further away just as people were supposed to be planting roots. Student debt hung around longer than it was supposed to. The ladder moved. That is real. And because that is real, the trap that followed was psychologically understandable. If the old arrival signals become unaffordable, the culture does not stop selling arrival. It simply changes the costume. If you cannot buy the house, then at least buy the experiences. If ownership looks distant, then collect memories, travel, restaurants, weekends away, concerts. Taste lifestyle not as property but as story. This was not sold merely as indulgence. That would have been too obvious. It was sold as wisdom spent on experiences, not things live your life. You cannot take money with you. This was a very effective message because it contained enough truth to feel enlightened. Experiences do matter. Life should be lived. Not every dollar must become a spreadsheet. All of that is true, but what made the trap dangerous was that experience spending became, for many people, not one enjoyable category among others, but a substitute for asset building itself. Marcus did not spend because he was a fool. He spent because the alternative future felt blocked and the present was still there asking to be lived. That is what I want you to hear. The trap was not just consumption, it was emotional compensation. If the old wealth markers are unavailable, then the culture tells you to build an identity around living well in the meantime. So Marcus built memories, good ones, real ones, brunches, trips, weekends, a version of a rich life without the old rich assets. And because the culture praised that choice, the financial cost stayed hidden for a long time. That is what makes millennial experience spending so revealing. It often looked healthier than the older versions of status consumption. It looked less materialistic, more evolved, less tacky, more alive, but economically, it could still serve the same function. It could still delay ownership, still delay capital accumulation, still consume the very gap that needed to be planted. The costume changed, the function stayed the same. That is the heart of this whole issue. Every generation thinks its version is morally superior to the last. Often it is just the same mistake translated into the symbols that its own era finds respectable. Marcus' trap was not that he loved experience. It was that experience became the socially approved excuse for not building enough assets while time was still favorable. Now Zoe's generation is fascinating because on paper it looks more financially literate than any before it. Index funds at 19, compound interest in casual conversation, finance, TikTok, budgeting apps, brokerage accounts opened before many earlier generations even knew what a brokerage account was. That sounds like progress, and it is to some degree, but literacy does not automatically dissolve the trap. It only changes its shape again. For Gen Z, the arrival signal is not the suburban house, not even the polished lifestyle in the old Gen X sense, not the passport, stamped memory life of the millennial either. It is aesthetic wealth, taste displayed publicly. The apartment that looks good on camera, the clean setup, the brands that signal discernment, the body, the wardrobe, the coffee, the desk, the lighting, the backdrop, the appearance of being ahead. And here is the especially cruel twist. A person can now perform financial intelligence as part of that same aesthetic. Zoe invests a little. She posts the language. She knows the terms. She may be the most financially aware 24-year-old in her family's history that matters. But if she is investing 50 a month and spending 200 maintaining the visual performance of a certain life, then the trap is still active. The signal is just more self-aware. That is what makes Gen Z's version so subtle. It can include the language of wealth without the mathematics of wealth. It can include the look of financial consciousness without the actual speed of compounding. Again, the trap is not ignorance, it is performance. The need to look as though the future is already underway in visible form. And because life is online now, the pressure is constant. Every purchase can become content. Every choice can become branding. Every visible upgrade can be interpreted as personal progress. This makes the trap harder, not easier, because now the audience is larger and the temptation to perform arrival begins much earlier. Zoe is not doomed, far from it. She may have time that earlier generations would envy. But the trap waits for her in the exact same place it waited for the others. At the point where looking financially mature starts competing with becoming financially strong. That is the common mistake. Not a spending problem only. Not an investing problem only. A signal problem. Every generation gets taught what doing well looks like. Then it spends years funding the signal instead of building the substance behind it. That is why I said at the beginning that these are not four separate traps. They are one trap with four wardrobes for Robert. Arrival meant the house for Karen, the upgraded life for Marcus, the lived life for Zoe, the curated life. Different symbols. Same function. That is the whole thing. Now, if you want to escape this trap, you must first understand something human beings do not naturally like. You must be willing to look less wealthy than you are so that one day you can become wealthier than you look. That sounds almost childish when phrased that way. It is one of the hardest rules in the world to follow, because every social instinct pushes the other direction. When income rises, signal it. When life improves, show it. When you get access to nicer things, use them as proof. That is what nearly everyone around you is doing, to resist. That impulse is not only a financial choice, it is a psychological rebellion against your own era. That is why it is so rare. Let us go back through the four stories and ask what escape would have looked like in each one. For Robert, the answer was not, do not buy the house. That would be too simple and too glib. The answer was this, do not let the house become the whole retirement philosophy. Own it, yes. Value it, yes. But build the pension alternatives, the liquid investments, the other streams, the other protections alongside it. Do not confuse one strong asset with a complete foundation. For Karen, escape would have been surprisingly simple in theory and surprisingly difficult in practice. Every raise gets split. One upgrade, perhaps half the rest banked automatically. Let income growth outpace lifestyle growth. Not forever. Long enough for the asset base to become undeniable. That is the move. Most people get a raise and then ask what part of life now deserves improvement. The future wealthy person asks what percentage of this raise can disappear into investments before my lifestyle learns that I received it at all. That is a very different reflex for Marcus. Escape is not never travel. I reject simplistic sermons like that. Life matters. But one big trip instead of four. One good restaurant night instead of reflexive weekend spending. A non-negotiable monthly index, fund contribution before the next experience gets booked. Not experience as identity. Experience inside a structure where assets are still being built every month without fail. That is the difference. And for Zoe, the answer is maybe the clearest of all. Make the real number grow faster than the image of the number post. Less of the look. Build more of the account. Let the substance get ahead of the aesthetic. That is a very wise correction for a generation living under endless visual pressure. Now I want to say something important here because people often hear this kind of argument and become too moralistic. This is not about rejecting pleasure. It is not about punishing yourself. It is not about becoming boring. It is not even about pretending that houses, nice lives, trips, and aesthetics have no place in a good life. Of course they do. The question is sequence. Assets first, lifestyle second. That is the rule, not forever. Just until the assets are doing enough work that the lifestyle is truly funded rather than borrowed from the future. That sequence changes everything. If you reverse it, you get the appearance of success with a fragile base. If you preserve it, you get a slower looking beginning and a much stronger middle and end. That is how wealth actually gets built. Not by looking arrived, by becoming durable. And durability is a beautiful word in finance. A durable life can absorb surprises. A durable retirement can survive bad markets. A durable household does not have to panic every time the world becomes expensive. Durability is far more valuable than performance. Now let us widen this beyond the four people. Why does every generation fall for a new version of the same error? Because each generation receives not only an economy but a cultural script. A script about adulthood, a script about reward, a script about what success should feel like and what shape it should take. And those scripts are rarely written by people who care most about your freedom. They are written by the forces of their era, post-war aspiration, corporate consumerism, Instagram culture, platform aesthetics, lifestyle media, the housing dream, the experience economy, the attention economy. None of these things ask first what will make you secure 30 years from now. They ask what will feel meaningful, admired, or desirable. Now, that is what makes the trap collective. People think their spending decisions are entirely personal. Often they are social mimicry with a thin layer of individual taste laid on top. You see what gets rewarded, you absorb it, then you act it out. That is why awareness matters so much. The minute you can say out loud, "My generation taught me to confuse this signal with actual arrival," the spell weakens. That is what I want for you. Not shame, not self-hatred, clarity. Because the first step out of any trap is naming it without flinching. So let me ask you the question I would ask if we were sitting together. What is your Generation S costume? Is it the house that became the whole plan, the lifestyle that rose with every direct deposit, the experience pattern that felt like wisdom while assets stayed thin, the aesthetic that performs wealth faster than wealth compounds? Which version are you living right now? And here is the harder question. What would it look like, specifically, for you to reverse the sequence? Not in theory this month. Would it mean downsizing the signal and widening the savings gap? Would it mean redirecting the next raise before it touches your visible life? Would it mean cutting back on one kind of experience so the automatic investment can finally become meaningful? Would it mean spending less on things designed to be seen and more on things designed to accumulate? Wealth is often not built through one giant act of genius. It is built through repeated refusal to keep funding the costume before the foundation exists. Refusal to let other people's idea of arrival become your financial destiny. Refusal to keep choosing the visible reward over the invisible asset. That is the real discipline. And it is harder than budgeting because it asks you to resist your own culture. I have always believed that the strongest investors are not simply better with numbers. They are better at withstanding social pressure. The crowd is usually spending toward a signal. The future wealthy person is quietly funding a structure. The crowd will often look ahead in the short run. That is the price. Then time begins revealing the truth. The one who looked less rich becomes the one who actually is. The one who seemed behind becomes the one with options. The one who delayed the costume becomes the one who can afford the life without fear. That is the irony almost every generation misses until much later. The things that make you look arrive too early are often the things that keep arrival from ever becoming real. So I will leave you with one clean rule: assets first, lifestyle second. Every time that is not a punishment, that is not denial, that is not asking you to live small forever. It is asking you to make the invisible part of wealth large enough that one day the visible part can finally rest on something real. And when you do that, the trap breaks. Not because your generation changed, because you did,